What's up, gamers? Aaron Shack here, and it's episode 30 of the Shackcast. And today's topic is going to be The Last of Us, the TV show, season one, and video game remakes. We're going to get into a little bit of a discussion on that afterwards. And then I also want to talk about the passing of legendary actor Lance Reddick. You may know him from Destiny, you may know him from The Wire, Netflix's new Resident Evil series, or One Night in Miami. He was in that movie as well. I mean, he's had a legendary and storied career, and having played Zavala in Destiny, we'll have a lot to talk about. But let's go ahead and start with the big topic, and that is HBO's The Last of Us TV series. And if you didn't already know from my YouTube channel, I am a big fan of The Last of Us. I even have here on screen, if you're watching the YouTube video, I have a statue here of Ellie playing the guitar that Joel gives her. And I actually have this guitar, this Taylor guitar that's featured in the game with the moth inlay on the frets. It's really, really a beautifully made guitar. It sounds gorgeous. It's one of my great acoustic guitars that I have. And I have a couple videos of playing it on the channel as well. But yeah, I'm a very big fan. I've played through the games multiple times, and I've enjoyed the series quite a bit. So it was definitely an easy get for me to be interested in the TV series. Um, but yeah, I want to kind of talk about here um, what I think about the show, what I think it did right, what I think it did wrong, stuff like that. So we had a 9 episode season, which I think is actually a little light for a TV show, especially one that has this much ground to cover. I feel like 9 episodes just really isn't enough. I think at minimum, a 13 episode order would have been probably perfect for the show. Although I think had they done something crazy like a 18, 20, 22 episode order, they could have really hit every single moment from the game that felt really powerful without getting too gratuitous into the violence, much like a video game would, where, I've talked about this at length, is that they can't really, even though this has been a pretty letter for letter remake, they can't really just bring in every single moment, every single encounter, every single shootout. It just wouldn't make sense. And at some point, the violence, you'd become sort of desensitized to it as a viewer of a TV show, right? You would just be like, oh, here we go. It's another shootout against, raiders, or oh, here we go. It's another infected thing. But I think one of the things that the show did poorly was that there was not enough infected in the show. Season or part one of The Last of Us, meaning the first game, concentrated pretty heavily on the infected. I mean, it was very much sort of a zombie survival type thing, but the Last of Us story at its core is about people, right? And so it's about how people can be at their best and at their worst. It shows like what raiders are capable of doing. It shows, sort of what a surrogate father can all of a sudden become for some girl he hardly knows, right? And this great protector that he becomes. And then it brings in the moral questions that come in around the last episode. And I will have timestamps here, so as we get into more like spoilery type stuff, if you just want to skip to later on in the video, I can't really help you guys on the podcast by doing timestamps there that I know of. But yeah, I can do little timestamps, and you can just skip on to the next section if you haven't fully watched everything about the Last of Us TV series. But yeah, I think they could have covered more substantially stuff like that. I think the show did a good job at hitting the major moments and making sure that those major moments that happen throughout the story are accounted for. And I think they even handled some of them differently. And they even spread more lore into the universe. They dove deeper on certain characters and on certain moments. And there were conversations, that you don't get too many of those in a narrative-based video game, because at some point, there has to be gameplay, there has to be action. The player wants a hands-on experience. So while there are some really good motion cutscenes throughout the video game, um, you can't have too much of it, otherwise you end up with something like Metal Gear Solid 4, where you're watching like an 8-hour movie and there's really only like 3 or 4 hours of gameplay. Like it's kind of difficult in that sense. So I'll talk about each episode here. So we'll start with the introductory episode, episode 1. I think it does a good job in establishing that this is going to be a really good video game adaptation. I could tell that right out the gate, because they created the world. They started introducing you to the lore of how the virus was happening, stuff that even in the game we didn't really know too much about it. We would pick up notes and we would interact with other characters, and dialogue would shed some light on stuff, but there wasn't always this level of world building. So that's one thing that a TV show or a movie can do for a video game, and I think this is going to be spoken as definitely up there in some of the top video game adaptations that have ever existed. Um, so yeah, the intro does a really good job of setting all that up. It goes pretty word for word, through the sort of outbreak and what happens with Joel and his daughter, and meeting up with Tess and Ellie and stuff like that, and just really putting a good foot forward. And I think it was good. As I was watching, I think it was really good that the episode was actually really long. Like, I was like, where are they gonna cut this first episode? Like, are they just gonna do Outbreak Day 1, or are they gonna go into like a little bit of what happens, years and years later, and then have him meet Ellie and sort of get the journey started at least a little bit. And I'm really glad. I think they got a lot in on that episode, and I think it was good and it was worthwhile, and it didn't feel like they were rushing it. But not to say that that doesn't happen later on in the series. So episode 2 is more about what happens to Tess, and sort of gets them on the journey and introduces the infected a little more in the sort of post pandemic world there that they're living in. And I think that episode was actually really strong, and I have no notes. So, once again, series starts off really strong. Episode 3 is a little contentious, and it's about Bill and Frank. And I think it's a really good episode, because Joel and Ellie sort of stop into Bill's town, and they're looking for supplies and they're looking for transportation to really help them get a leg up on this journey. And in the game they're supposed to meet up with Bill and go look for a car battery that they can put in this car so that they can get out of here and have some basic supplies. And then things happen, and at least in the game it plays out a little bit differently. And this one almost sort of falls as a flashback episode, which pretty much every series that you watch nowadays is going to have at least one or two flashback episodes in the first season, and maybe in future seasons as well. It's not super unusual. It's almost formulaic by design, and that can be a little boring at times when you're really invested in like the here and now of the story. But I think it does a good job of like really fleshing out a character that was very much a side character in the video games, where it was like, yeah, we just met him, hung out with him for a couple hours, got out of his town, never saw him again, never really knew what would happen after that. So they gave him a little bit of a different ending, and they shed more light on, his relationship with Frank. And I think it was actually a good episode, but like in the long run, it feels like maybe if we had trimmed this one down a little bit and had maybe I don't know, it feels like if you're going to spend a lot of time fleshing out little flashback episodes, like you need to make sure that you have more episodes on the back end to keep telling the continuous story all the way through. And so it sort of feels like if we're spending a whole episode here just talking about very insignificant characters in the grand scheme of things, like that's a lot of real estate that we're taking away from the full story here. So that's really my only complaint about the episode. It's not anything bad about the episode itself, but I think it was really good. Number 4 is when they sort of start getting into Kansas City, and I think this was well done too, and it was kind of interesting to see that there was sort of this leader of the Raiders and that they were sort of going after people that were sympathizers with Fedra and stuff like that. And so it sort of showcases the bigger story going on between groups like the Fireflies and the Raiders and Fedra, and how Fedra is sort of trying to reestablish the old world and order by any means necessary, and just very much willing to go to any lengths necessary. And sometimes those are making the wrong choices. And then Raiders, of course, are sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. They're more into that anarchy type stuff. And, they really just think, hey, we can survive on our own without Fedra and without, all this other stuff. And then you kind of have the Fireflies that are like somewhere in the middle, I would say, of both of the groups. They're not quite as radical as Raiders, because Raiders are, they're raping, they're killing, they're hanging people, they're doing all sorts of bad stuff. Whereas, yeah, and they're like robbing people too. So, I mean, a lot of crimes on that end. But, Fireflies are kind of in the middle, where it's like they're trying to rebel against the government, but they're not quite as bad as the Raiders. So, I mean, they make for an interesting group as well. But I think that episode, and then episode 5 following, which was heavily about Sam and Henry, I think those were actually really strong episodes, and those were core parts of the game that they were hitting. I wish they spent a little more time in what we would call the sewers section, because in the game that was like a really moving area that these people had sort of made like a little daycare in a little survival area in the sewers, and they had rules, and they had, you could tell that they had children there. And then, just sort of walking through it and seeing art on the walls, or like, dead bodies here and there, and finding notes, explaining things, or seeing how they wrote rules all over the place, stay quiet, don't do this, don't waste the shower water, catch the rainwater from here, stuff like that. Like it really showcased it told a story without having to force feed it down your throat with cutscenes or conversations and stuff like that. It was something that you, as the gamer, would just sort of explore and pick up these notes and sort of infer the story yourself by learning, just by exploring the world. So it's kind of a world building that's built on exploration. So I think the show did it a little bit, but like that could have been a really moving thing that they could have hit on a little more. And I think, of course, this is pretty much one of the last times we see infected. Is when they sort of just, I guess they disturb one of the tendrils, which wakes them up, and they come bashing out of the ground. They kill all the raiders, and Joel is just up there in the sniper nest, just like you get to do in the game, and he's defending everybody from, his core group, at least, from that. And so I think the Henry and Sam story was still very moving, and I think what they added to it, with the little brother, being deaf and having to like write out or sign whatever he's trying to say, was like really, that was really moving, and it didn't feel like it was forced or non-essential. Like it really had some weight in a world where you have to stay quiet. And I think kind of the fear that those brothers have is like, not only can they not make noise, but they have to somehow communicate silently. And I think that kind of plays to their advantage. But the issue is that if you have someone who is deaf, they cannot hear the infected. So that puts you in a very difficult state. And so watching those two look out for each other, it's definitely a mirror of Joel and Ellie's situation. It's pretty interesting stuff, and I think they did a really good job with that as well. Episode 7 is pretty much, picking up on the part where Joel gets injured at the university, which I thought was really rushed. I mean, they pretty much just walked in and walked out. And I think in the game it was a much bigger exploration of Joel sort of explaining how the old world works. He explains the rules of football. He explains, what a university is, because it's really a foreign concept to someone like Ellie that was not born in the regular world as we know it. And I think it just gets rushed, and they end up like leaving almost immediately, and not really discovering much lore on like what did the Fireflies set up here, why did they go, stuff like that. They didn't even run into any infected, and they really just ran into the 4 people, one of which Joel kills, but then he gets stabbed by one. And then that leads into to the what we call the Left Behind DLC from The Last of Us, which was a downloadable content chapter which shed more light on Ellie's backstory. And then there was also like a secondary thing happening in the modern day where she's hunting down supplies to stitch up Joel from his injuries. So I mean, this episode kind of rushes through the stitching up of Joel and focuses more on her relationship with her best friend Riley, and how they get bit, and how Ellie discovers that she is immune. And so I think it was a good episode overall. But once again, it's another flashback episode. And so you kind of hope that there would be more episodes to flesh out all of the main story encounters along the way. Episode 8 would be when David comes into play, and Troy Baker plays James in this episode, who is the original Joel from the video game, and James is essentially the right-hand man of David. And I think this episode was really well done. I think they hit all the parts that they had to hit, this was very much an Ellie story. It was definitely about her defending herself. We're expecting Joel to kind of heal up, and make his way there and come to save her. And he really just shows up just in time to catch the aftermath and get her out of there before things get worse, right? But yeah, I kind of wish they had shown more of that, because a lot of killing in the video game happened in that chapter. I mean, not only was Ellie having to escape from captivity and kill a lot of people and try to escape, and then she gets to the lodge and battles with David, but like Joel is having to battle the whole way just to get to her. And I think that gravity could have showed more. It could have shown a lot. But I still think it hit all the notes that it needed to, and it hit very much the religious angle, the cannibalism angle, the we're starving people type thing as well. So I mean, I think they did a good job with all that. Um, but yeah, by the time the episode ends, you're wanting more. And then of course episode 9 is Look for the Light. That's the final episode where they sort of make their way towards the hospital, and then the big decision of the series happens. They find out that the Fireflies want to take out Ellie's brain, and sort of, come up with a cure from that, which would kill her. And there's no certainty that this would work. And so that's kind of the moral dilemma that's put in front of Joel. He's not given the chance to say goodbye to this person that you can really tell, especially by episode 9, that he's really not wanting to complete this journey. He's like, we could turn back, we could live a happy life, we could go back with Tommy in Jackson, and live with those people, and survive there, and probably live out a good life until the end of our days. But Ellie decides, we got to see this through, and she very much wants to be the cure, but it's unclear as to whether, and it's pretty clear that she didn't know the consequences, but she knew that she could be the cure, but she did not know if it would cost her her life. And I don't think anyone would tell her that. Otherwise, you could end up with a dilemma where you would have to force her to be, tranquilized and then do the surgery. And so it really does do a good job of showcasing how and why Joel made that decision. He just immediately goes on that killing spree that we know of in the game, because we get to play as Joel at that point, and we're just plowing through all the Fireflies to get to Ellie, who we've grown very close with. And then he rescues her, and at the end of the game, he lies to her. He says, that there was no cure. There's other people like you, and that had to get you out of there. There was a fight or whatever. Marlene didn't make it, and Marlene didn't make it because she stood in the way. And Joel knew that she would never give up hunting them down, so he had to kill Marlene, as tragic as that is. And I think Marlene was a little more fleshed out because they had Ashley Johnson, the original voice actress of Ellie, come in on that episode, and she played Ellie's mother who got bit, and that sort of explains like the lore of why Ellie might be immune, is because her mother was bit as she was born, thus born with some immunity or some sort of um, DNA in her blood or whatever that's sort of telling the cordyceps infection like, hey, I'm one of you, so it doesn't attack her system. So I think that was really good, and it really fleshed out all the characters, and it added some interesting and much needed lore to the show. But once again, it always brings up the same age-old discussion that we've probably been having for the past 10 years, and it's really about, should that decision have been made, or was it, Joel very much wanted someone to replace his daughter in his life, and he kind of found that. Um, and at first he wasn't really looking for that, but then they grew close, and he found that. So he didn't want to give her up, but that's also sort of condemning the fate of the entire human race. If there's a chance that the cure works, but I think that just wasn't good enough for him. It could either be the science, or it could be just the fact that he's stubborn, just doesn't want to sacrifice one life for the many, especially in a world full of all the people that he's met to make it this far in the journey. um do these people deserve it, or should only the best and brightest, like the people in Jackson, survive? No. So it's an interesting moral question back and forth, and a lot of the questions around this are, does this negate the need to play the video game? I would say no. If you are a gamer, I think this is definitely a good video game to pick up and play. But of course, it brings in a whole new audience of non-gamers to sort of experience this story, and I think that's probably the most important takeaway of it. So once again, it does hit all the cliff notes, but like, it's kind of like you could either read this whole book, right? Or you could just read the cliff notes. But the cliff notes really just add supplementation, explanation to the book, help you better understand the book, but it's condensed, right? And it's impossible to make a TV show or a movie cover the same amount of ground that a 20, 40, 80-hour video game could do, depending on what game we're talking about. So it's very difficult in that realm. But I think it still holds up really well, and I wish it had been longer. And they have already mentioned that they're going to get into The Last of Us Part 2, but they said that it will take multiple seasons. So it's possibly going to be true that Part 2 will be over, like Season 2, Season 3, however long it needs to be to sort of tell the continuation of the story here. So, I mean, that could be exciting, but I definitely know a lot of people, and I won't get into spoilers here, that there probably will be sort of a divide here where people that are not familiar with the game may not really like the events that are going to take place in Season 2, potentially. They did say that they're going to make some changes, but I don't think they're going to make changes to the core story and the big events that are about to happen in Season 2. So I compare it very much to Season 6 of The Walking Dead, which I won't spoil, but I will just say that there were decisions made in Season 6 that a lot of people were like, wow, that was my favorite character. I'm done watching this show. And you had a big divide there. But like, it was also a really good storytelling element that nobody was safe. That's really cool. But yeah, overall, I think it's a good show. It's a good adaptation. But at the same time, I would have liked just a little more. And I don't feel like it's being super greedy in this sense by saying I wish they would have told more of the story, but I can just think of certain elements of the story where they ran into infected or they ran into raiders and stuff like that, and it felt like they got across the country fairly quickly, and like there were very little incidents along the way, especially if these 9 episodes are meant to be just the small little different cities that they pass through in the U.S. and they run into a problem in each city, right? And just it doesn't carry as much emotional weight as the game. And I sort of compare this to Lord of the Rings. It's like, Frodo meets his fellowship in the first movie, and then let's just pretend the second movie gets completely cut out, and then we go to Return of the King. And it's like, yeah, it's the end. And so now the journey just doesn't feel like it had as much weight because they met up, they started on the journey, and they ran to like 2 or 3 places. Now they're at the end, they throw the ring in the volcano, it's done. So like without the two towers, like Lord of the Rings feels very incomplete. It doesn't feel like this incredibly long journey that we've been with these characters for a very long time. And we've seen every moment that they've had, every step along the way, whether it was with orcs, with humans, with good people, with bad people, all across all these different Middle Earth, races and elements interacting throughout the story to tell this really grand tale of how they pretty much pass through the entire, world of Middle Earth. They're crossing across a very large portion of that world. And so The Last of Us feels empty in that sense that we didn't get as much of that as we did in the game. And so really that's my last and most critical note on that. So, now we're going to talk about remakes. Video game remakes have been a big and contentious item over recent years. Sometimes it's felt like it's been too soon to do a remake of this, or sometimes it's been long overdue to do a remake of a certain game. Some people will even argue about the validity of needing to do a remake or a remaster. And just to quickly preface this, remakes are when, you sort of take a game and rebuild it from the ground up, whereas a remaster is just sort of taking the existing game and bumping the visuals up a bit, getting the resolution up a little bit, stuff like that. Very little minute changes. So The Last of Us actually had a remake recently to launch, coinciding with the TV show. They wanted to have it out ahead of time so that when people watch the TV show and get curious about the video game, they'll pick up The Last of Us Part 1, and its visuals are consistent with The Last of Us Part 2, which is a more recent video game entry. And so they wanted to make sure that visuals, gameplay, all that stuff is very consistent across the board, because The Last of Us, the original game, was from 2013, and then they remastered it in 2014 for the PS4, and then, of course, we're getting The Last of Us Part 1 in 2022 for the PS5, and then here, March 28th of 2023, we're getting The Last of Us Part 1 coming to PC for the first time. A lot of exciting things there, but yeah, just sort of explaining why that remake is so good and why it needed to be made. But getting into the topics of other remakes, we've had a lot of remakes coming out recently. We've had the Final Fantasy VII remake. They even did Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core last fall. They did a little remake of that. The Resident Evil games have been in sort of a remake pipeline for a while. The original Resident Evil was remade on the GameCube a while back, and then it was launched on, PC and Xbox, and now it's pretty much everywhere. The original Resident Evil and Resident Evil Zero are everywhere now, available on every platform: Switch, PC, Xbox, PlayStation, all gens from like PS4 to Xbox One till now. And that's a really good deal. And then what they started doing was remaking Resident Evil 2 and 3, and now 4 is about to come out on March the 24th. And so these remakes have been really good. They've been very much faithful adaptations, with sort of a new approach to gameplay rather than fixed camera angles. It was, third-person shooter with, puzzle elements, zombie survival, item management, survival horror, all of these elements at play. And so we're about to get into Resident Evil 4 this week, and that's pretty exciting. We got to play the Chainsaw demo, as it was called, and this is one of the only Resident Evils I actually haven't played other than some of the spin-offs. And this also brings up the discussion of, should Resident Evil Code Veronica be next in line for a remake? I was actually hoping they would do that before Resident Evil 4, because, you know, in timeline sense, you know, if you did 2, 3, Veronica, and then Resi 4, that would have made a little bit of sense. But I mean, obviously, this is a very popular game in the franchise, and so it very much deserves said remake. And so it's been very well done. Another remake that we've had recently and just finished yesterday on the channel was the Dead Space remake, which once again, very much like the Resident Evil remakes, this game was loyal to the source material, and potentially in some ways, I think the Dead Space remake actually surpasses the original, because not only did they give Isaac a voice in this game and he actually talks, but they added lore that's based on the first 3 games, the first 3 Dead Space games. And because we already know the elements of the first Dead Space, we can sort of apply what we learn in 2 and 3 and do some world building in 1, so that if they were to remake part 2 of Dead Space, then, you know, you would already have the Church of Unitology, you would have the story of Isaac's family, Isaac and Nicole, all of this stuff. You would have all this lore built up leading into what's going to happen in the second and third game. And we have heard that Motive Studio has been doing a little bit of polling to sort of gauge audience reactions. You know, everyone's really loved this remake, and so they were saying, well, what would you think if we continued remaking the series? And then my question to pose to you all would be like, well, would you like to see perhaps what Motive Studio would do with a Dead Space 4 if they were allowed to take this character and its world in their own direction? Because after playing this, they did a faithful remake, but they added to it in ways that amped up the fear. So rather than having to use your upgrade nodes, which you normally use to upgrade your armor, your weapons, and stuff like that, you used to have to also have this trade-off where it was like nodes could also open locked doors in the game. And these were like optional rooms that would have like extra lore or extra, you know, hidden weapon upgrades, or extra ammo and materials and stuff like that. Well, in this game, they had you do things like divert the lights or divert oxygen. You know, so you would have to make choices. You'd be like, well, would you rather turn the lights off and unlock all the doors, or would you rather, you know, divert life support for a little bit and just run off your oxygen tank and try to, you know, loot the area quickly and deal with the enemies quickly? But when you pull out the oxygen, it's like there's very little sound. And then, of course, there's a lot of zero gravity moments paired in with all that. And so I think doing that and introducing clearance codes and having to do sort of a master key side quest where you go around and find everybody's rigs and then put them into the computer on the bridge, thus giving you a max clearance master key that can open all the lockers, all the doors, blah, blah, blah. But of course, as you play the game, your clearance level, you know, goes up as you play. You get clearance level 1, 2, 3, stuff like that. And then eventually you get the master override, which allows you to access everything, which is, I thought, was a really cool way to sort of flesh that out and make it different and make it to where I wasn't juggling between upgrade nodes and opening doors with said nodes. I could just simply use the nodes to upgrade everything. So I think in some ways like that, the side quests, the exploration, the fact that there's no load times, you just explore the Ishimura, you can walk around, you can take the tram, but there's no stops, there's no load times unless you die. There's no load times other than when you initially start up the game. So pretty good, pretty dope experience. And that poses my final question that I have for you is, now that we're seeing remakes being so prevalent in our industry, and we're actually going to see more remakes this year, Resident Evil 4 being one, Final Fantasy 7 is going to have its next episode as a part of its story here. We've kind of had the first episode, and then we had Crisis Core, which kind of serves as a prequel, and then we're going to finally get into the continuation of the remake. We're also going to have Resident Evil 4, we're going to have Silent Hill 2, and we had Dead Space, so it's like, it's a lot of remakes this year, and it's not unusual to get 1 or 2 or maybe more remakes a year in the gaming industry now. And so my question is, should the Game Awards, you know, hosted by Jeff Keighley, perhaps have a remake category of like what makes a good remake and or remaster, and how would we sort of grade those. And I believe that that deserves like a separate sort of award for that. We've seen some of them, in best action or adventure categories or whatever like that, but we've not seen them in a special category that I think could be really competitive. So I think it's a good question, a good, exciting thing. So, final thing I want to talk about on the show is incredible actor and voice actor Lance Reddick. We just learned yesterday, March 17th, 2023, that Lance Reddick has passed away at the age of 60. If you play video games, you might know him as Zavala in Destiny. He is the Titan guardian that is sort of he has all the strike missions that you do. You go to him to get strike bounties from the tower, and you go talk to him as you're doing quests and missions, and as you're playing through the main story. He's very much the voice of logic in the tower of the three people. There's Cade, there's Ikora, and there's Zavala, and each one, Ikora's for the warlocks, and Zavala's for the Titans, and Cade was for the hunters. And so, for each faction or class that you chose, you would come and talk to these three characters, and then you would interact with them throughout the story. And Zavala was always sort of this calm voice of reason, even though he's a very strong and powerful guy, and he's an Awoken, which is a certain type of race in Destiny. And I thought it was really cool. And the interesting thing about Lance is that he played Destiny, and he would always talk about the game, and he would show videos of him playing the game and him petting his dogs. And he would often on Twitter, one of the things I really enjoyed was he would just make short little videos of him reciting poetry or reading books, or just saying kind of interesting quotes and trying to be thought provoking. And he often had a very good moral side to what he was trying to say, and I just really enjoyed that. And I think he was just this beautiful light in the world that we don't really see all that often. But here's on screen, I'm going to show a little picture of Zavala in case you need a little refresher there. But that's Zavala from Destiny, and I'm going to go back to the photo of Lance there. But yeah, he is also a critically acclaimed actor. I mean, he's very well known for The Wire. He was recently in Netflix's Resident Evil series as Albert Wesker, and then of course he was in One Night in Miami. You can definitely browse his IMDb. He's been in a lot of different movies. John Wick being another thing, and apparently Keanu actually visited him on set as he was filming some of his scenes, and it just seemed like he had this really unique admiration for him, and really a beautiful thing. And so in the John Wick franchise, you'd know him as a sort of the concierge guy that's at the hotel, and he's the front desk guy, and he ends up watching the dog, and he always had such a really good and beautiful and serious voice, and a certain tone that's just really good. And so it was always nice to see him in any movie he was in or in any video game, and listen to his voice lines, and of course online just hearing him cite stuff and read things to us. I thought he's a really beautiful voice in the world. So Lance Reddick, rest in peace, and you will be remembered. And currently in Destiny, there's a lot of people flocking around Zavala and kneeling in front of him, and sort of giving him some respect in game. And he also showed up in the Payday series as a character, and I believe they were announcing that his character, they had already recorded lines or something, and it's possible he'll still appear in Payday 3. Beautiful thing. And a beautiful person, gone way too soon. And I think that's what hurts the most, him being only 60. Well, gamers, that's all I have for you here. That is the Shackcast episode 30. We talked about The Last of Us, video game remakes, and the passing of incredible actor Lance Reddick. Thank you to you all. Thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else, appreciate you for tuning in, and definitely drop a review. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you have any topics that you'd like for me to cover on the Shackcast, let me know down there. So, once again, thank you for being here. Be safe, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye.